Very warm welcome from my side. It is a pleasure to be back, at least for us here in Europe from our summer break that has, as Olivier already said, let us breathe a little bit more, but nonetheless, we have quite a few developments here. So we look forward to covering, as Olivier said, these grounds a bit more in detail in the coming hour. So we will, as usually, start with a short overview of the trends that we have observed for the last quarter before then diving right into any key developments on the international plane on the level of the European Union, before then having a closer look at EU country level developments, and then diving into a bit more detail into our focus topic today. And this focus topic will today focus on the Swiss Code of Obligations here and new proposed amendments to the code to align here sustainability reporting obligations to those a little bit more to those of the EU's corporate sustainability reporting directive. So here also quite some interesting developments that have happened here in Switzerland. Last but not least, we will also, of course, then have a look at other country level developments that have happened around the globe before, of course, then looking forward to a question and answer round with you all. Yes, so I'm Camille, as I said, and Tennessee is also going to be here speaking a little bit later, of course. And so we're very happy to be here today and talk to you as always on these regulatory developments. So with no further ado, let's jump into the key trends that happened. So, well, I'll walk you through from left to right. Here on the top left corner here, we have listed, as always, an overview of the top developments, that topics of the last quarter. Here, it doesn't surprise us too much. Non-financial reporting, we have really observed as the topic that has been dominating. Here, really, we see now more and more in the European Union member states that have worked on transposing the EU's corporate sustainability reporting directive into their national laws. So here really some developments in the European Union. Then also environmental risks really as a topic continues to really be here of interest and is still a topic that we see pop up quite frequently. This is also followed by due diligence that we have, especially with the entry into force of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive in July in the EU, of course, being a topic that has been quite prominent. Taxonomy, it doesn't surprise us either, has also stayed here, one of the key topics that have been trending with many different countries around the world really adopting their taxonomy that is a bit more adapted to the local context. So also really a development that has been ongoing here for quite a bit. Last but not least, also not a too big surprise, biodiversity continues to be a developing topic here also, especially in the lead up to the COP16 taking place in Colombia next month. We can really also expect biodiversity to remain one of the key topics that are of interest here. Then staying on the left-hand side of the slide here, one key open consultation that we would like to really also draw your attention to, I just mentioned, and we will deep dive a little bit more into this, is the Swiss Federal Council that is consulting on amendments to the Swiss Code of Obligations to really more closely align non-financial reporting expectations with the EU CSRD. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Tennessee will also talk a bit more in detail here, but the amendments would really be phased in over the next 2 years. And this consultation is still ongoing and will end at the end of October. So if any of you are interested in learning a bit more about these amendments or even taking part in these consultations, you have still a bit of time. Moving to the top right corner here, key highlights from the last quarter is really here the spotlight on the transposition process for EU member states that were required by July 6th in the summer here to transpose the CSRD into their respective national legislations. How it often happens with these transposition of directives, most member states have really completed this process. An example would be here France, Ireland, or Italy. Some member states are a little delayed that have, for instance, already introduced some drafts of their transposition. So an example here would be Germany, the Netherlands, and Spain. And there are still some that are lagging behind, such as, for instance, in Austria, Belgium, and Portugal, we have yet to see some draft being proposed that really here shows how these member states are transposing the CSRD. So here's still some developments to come, but this has really been a key development that has occupied the last quarter quite dominantly here. Then, last but not least, a little look into the future. We expect here on an international plane the Science Based Targets Initiative to publish a draft of its revised corporate net zero standard here for public consultation within the next quarter. And here, really, the aim of this revision is to make sure that the standard continues to be an up-to-date and also, very importantly, a credible standard to really set targets and deliver, of course, on ambitious science-based corporate targets here. So this is really also a development that we're looking forward to see what here the SBTI comes up with. Of course, we will also keep you up to date on this. And now, with no further ado, let's turn to international developments. Despite for us here in Europe being more of a quiet summer, we still have seen quite some developments here also globally. First up, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure here published some sector-specific guidance for quite a couple different sectors. So for example, here this covers guidance for the agriculture sector, biotechnology and pharmaceuticals, chemicals, electric utilities, power generations, food and agricultural, forestry and paper, metals and mining, as well as oil and gas. So if your organization is really active in some of these sectors, it definitely is worth having a closer look at these guidance that really aim to provide some context more on these sectors and how to really apply the recommendations of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures in a more sector-specific context. Likewise, the TNFD also published a more general guidance on analyzing upstream and downstream value chains. So if your organization is having a bit of challenges maybe, or is also really interested in seeing a bit more how to really analyze or understand nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities that really may arise in up and downstream value chains, this is definitely a guidance that is worth having a closer look at. Moving on to the Global Reporting Initiative, we saw the GRI publish quite an interesting questions and answer document that really has a closer look at the interface between the GRI standards and the sustainability reporting standards. So more specifically, the European sustainability reporting standards. So here, really, this document aims to outline the key differences, the key alignments here. And so if you are reporting under the GRI, for instance, and would like to see where there are certain touch points, some differences, but also alignment with the European reporting standards, this is definitely quite an interesting document to consult. Moving on to the Science Based Targets Initiative, we also saw it over the summer publish a building sector science-based target setting criteria. And this is really a decarbonization framework in the area of buildings to be used by companies and financial institutions in their buildings value chain. And this framework really sets out a 1.5 degree Celsius aligned emission reduction targets for the building industry to really overcome certain climate challenges that the SBTI has identified here, and really help also these to achieve or work towards a net zero future. So also quite an interesting document here that the SBTI published. Then also some news from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Also here, the protocol published some frequently asked questions and answers on its corporate standards. And more specifically, this document really includes questions on how to, for example, identify a company's emission sources, how to specifically calculate emissions, and also often something that has been identified as a challenge to really find reputable sources for emissions factors. So here also quite a brilliant document here to support in applying this corporate standard. And then last but not least, to close also again here on the topic of nature for the international regulatory plane, we also saw the Science-Based Targets Network publish an updated technical target setting guidance and a corporate manual. And here the corporate manual specifically helps companies here to set science-based targets for nature, and also really provides quite an interesting overview on existing technical guidance from the SBTN on the topic of nature targets. So if this is something that your organization is interested in to have a closer look at, we highly recommend to also dive here a little bit deeper into these developments. And with that, I am happy to hand over to Tennessee, that is going to give us a brief glimpse into what has been going on over the summer at a European Union level.
Thank you so much, Camille. Also, Alice and Olivier. A warm welcome from my side as well. It's a pleasure to be here and to now develop a little bit the EU one. So I've seen the questions that you have. I will partially answer it now and also later on with the focus, but I think we can discuss a little bit more at the end of the presentation. So as Olivier mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, the EU was quite slow for two reasons: the elections, of course, and also the summer break. So during summer, usually in the EU, we have quite of a slowdown. And this year with the elections, it has increased a little bit the slow activities that we have observed, because all these institutions had to really get installed before they start working on something. But we still have some news for you. A lot of guidance you will see, but the guidance are usually very, very helpful for companies, so it doesn't have to be neglected. And that is very important also to interpret the different regulations. So the first ones that we can mention and that we wanted to highlight to you is the FAQ about the implementation of the non-financial reporting requirements, sustainability reporting, as we should now say in the EU. So that is about the CSRD, the ESRS, that are the standards, and the EU taxonomy. So the EU Commission published this FAQ, and it brings a quite a nice overview of these three regulations, how they go together, and the main questions that addresses of this regulation usually ask. So it's always interesting to have a look at this. It's quite comprehensive and usually helpful. We also have the EFRAG, so the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, who released a new technical answer for the ESRS, so that is the standard. So that is part of the Q&A platform, and so they develop different technical answers, because these European standards are quite technical, and so they also answer the most frequently asked questions, but more on the technical side. So always interesting to have a look. Maybe you ask yourself one of the questions, so it could be interesting to have a look. It refers to some wording questions, but also qualitative characteristic of information, the double materiality, the value chain, some time horizons, and also some questions on each specific standards. Still on the on some guidance, we have the EFRAG, who published the XBRL taxonomy for the EU standards. So that is, this overall online platform and references that companies will have to follow, because that is this digital tagging of the CSRD that you will have to follow as a company. So they have now finalized this, and the EU Commission will have to finally adopt that, and it will be implemented at the same time as the European Single Access Point. So that goes together. It's again, the EU works on a full and comprehensive framework, so you have always these different links between the different regulations. Then we have some entry into force that happened in the last few months. That's the case of the EU Artificial Intelligence Act. Also the Eco-Design for Sustainable Product Regulation, also the Right to Repair Directive, and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD. That's all regulations that are important or have impact on companies. So we wanted to flag that to you because now it has entered into force. And that could have like the Artificial Intelligence Act in case you use this kind of risky tools, that you will have to now follow these requirements. Same for the eco-design. If you use the highly prioritized products, that you will have to implement all of these processes. And the Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, of course, a huge impact on companies. And on this CSDDD, we also have the FAQ from the EU Commission that was published. And that is very interesting because that covers different questions, especially about the scope, the exemptions, the content of requirements, also the enforcement. And that answers quite well different questions that you might ask yourself in the implementation of the CSDDD. For the CSDDD, I just mentioned that it has entered into force. That is correct. However, for the directives, the member states have to transpose. And for the CSDDD, the member states have 2 years to transpose. So that means that they have to transpose by July 2026. And with that, I will hand over back to Camille for the country level development in Europe.
Thank you so much, Tennessee. Yes, so very similar to how it was in the EU, it was fairly quiet in Europe. Nonetheless, we have a couple developments that are really worth mentioning here. So staying on the topic of the CSDDD, we have had the German government actually publish a growth initiative to improve Germany's competitiveness. And in this growth initiative, the German government also mentioned some interesting information on the transposition of the CSDDD into German law. As some of you might know, currently Germany already has the Corporate Due Diligence in Supply Chains Act that is applicable to companies in Germany that they already have to adhere to. And there have been some concerns, especially by smaller companies in Germany, about how to go about with this, with the obligations that are currently in place, and also then the more stringent obligations that will then apply with the transposition of the CSDDD into German law. And so here the German government took this growth initiative as a way to already communicate early on the way they will transpose the CSDDD. And here the German government has clarified that it intends to implement any rules set out in the CSDDD that go beyond those that are currently applicable under the Corporate Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act at the latest possible date. So anytime between 2027 to 2029. And this is really to give companies sufficient time to adapt to these new requirements. And here the government also emphasizes that companies can then choose to fulfill their reporting obligations under the Corporate Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act, or then already to prepare accordingly to already apply the more stricter rules that would apply under this new law that transposes the CSDDD into German law. So this will really be a means or a way to help here ease a little bit the pressure that certain companies have felt with this CSDDD. And so we really see here the German government taking a step towards here the companies and their concerns. We don't know more than that, so it's still quite an early stage onwards to really know how this is going to go about, but we will of course keep you posted in any developments that we see happening here. Moving on to Spain, we also saw that Spain has passed, or a law has entered into force that transposes EU directive on improving the gender balance amongst directors into Spanish law. So here, this is again a directive that needs to be transposed into the respective member states' national jurisdictions. And here, Spain has already now begun this journey, and this new law will start to apply to Spain's largest listed companies from June 30, 2026 onwards. So here, what is also important to note is that the law actually introduces gender quotas for certain company boards and also senior management. And in Spain here, the requirements are a bit more restrictive than those that were required by the EU directive. And so if your company is potentially affected by these new rules, we would really recommend to already have a look into this law to really make sure that then you're prepared for these new rules that will then begin to apply from June 2026 onwards. Maybe also on a side note, it is also good to know, as I just mentioned, this is a directive, so we will also see more and more other member states that will transpose this directive into their respective national laws. And they have time until the end of the year, so we will see more and more national member states really also then follow suit what Spain has also begun here. Moving on to Switzerland, we saw here amendments to the Swiss Federal Act on the reduction of CO2 emissions being published in the official compilation of the federal legislation. And so these amendments introduce emission reduction targets and measures starting from 2025 all the way to 2030. And these amendments will enter into force on January 1st, 2025, so quite soon already. The Federal Council also opened a consultation on amending the CO2 ordinance. And so here, proposed amendments would define sectoral reduction targets for greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And so here, it would really target specific sectors such as the transportation sector, agriculture, waste. And so this is really also an ongoing process, and the consultation still is ongoing until the 17th of October. So if this is also something of interest to you, you still have time to look a bit more into this document and to take part in the consultation. Moving on to the UK, last but not least, we also saw here new UK listing rules enter into force, and these also replace the previous version in the Financial Reporting Council handbook. And here, what is interesting, there's a newly created commercial companies category, and this now requires all companies that are covered by this new category to publish on a comply and explain basis a statement on how they adhere to the corporate code in their annual financial reports. And so here, this is really a part of this revision to the code, and companies and also funds that are subject to this UK listing rules will have to report to their adherence to this code for the accounting period that starts on January 1st, 2025. So really also a timeline that is fast approaching. So it is definitely, if your company is in scope here, it is definitely worth having a look at these requirements to see if there are any possible changes that would apply to your organization here. And with that, we're already through here with European countries, and I'm happy to hand over to Tennessee that will now, as promised, dive a bit deeper into the proposed amendments to the Swiss Code of Obligations.
Thank you so much, Camille. So here we thought, because Switzerland was a bit quiet, let's say, in the last semester. However, in the last few months, we observed some activities again in Switzerland. And one of these was this provision, the proposed new provision in the Code of Obligations, that the main purpose of that would be to align the Swiss Code of Obligations with the CSRD. So they have now opened a consultation on that, as Camille mentioned at the very beginning of the presentations. And again, overall, the main goal is to align the Swiss Code of Obligations to the CSRD. And we will see with the different elements that we wanted to highlight to you to show that this will really align the non-financial reporting obligations. That is the part of the Swiss Code of Obligations that would change to align with the CSRD. So in terms of scope, the scope would be extended, and that would be aligned with the scope of the CSRD. So, I mean, the scope would be extended as the thresholds would be reduced, right? So it would address more companies, and it will no longer be a cumulative conditions, but so that would mean that more companies would have to comply with the requirements. We would also have some assurance needed for the sustainability reporting information. So that would be an obligation now, and also Swiss companies would have the choice of using the European standards or an equivalent national or international standard. And here we don't have precisely the definition of that, because in the proposed ordinance, they refer to a future delegated ordinance or additional guidance from the Swiss Federal Council. So it still has to come. So in principle, that would apply like this, but still some things have to be defined. So the consultation closes mid-October. You still have a bit of time if you want to dive into that and maybe to answer the consultations. And if these requirements enter into force as they are proposed, they would enter into force after 2 years. So you would have like a phase-in of 2 years between the entry into force of the new provision and the application of the new requirements. Some key points to be mentioned here. So what would change, if we can go to the next slide? Important to mention that the comply or explain approach will no longer be applicable as the CSRD, as it is in the CSRD. We will also have the reporting that would cover the full value chain. So that includes the upstream and downstream activities of a company. And so that would also include the activities of companies involved in financing products. We would also have, so these informations on sustainability issues will have to be disclosed either in a separate report or in the annual report. And wherever this is reported, you would have to anyway provide an assurance on it. So to have an audit. This goes in the same way, exact same way as in the CSRD in the EU, that to bring together the financial and the non-financial informations. In terms of language, you would have to write the report in one of the national language or in English, and the electronic format will also have to be used. And finally, the report will also have to be approved by the highest management or administrative body in a company, and also by the body responsible for approving the company's annual accounts. But here, just to mention, this is already existing within the non-financial reporting obligations that you have in Switzerland. So this will not bring you additional requirements. So that is a short and quick focus on Switzerland. We wanted to highlight that to you because that is something important that could happen to you, even though the CSRD might already be applicable to you, not already, because for that you would have to wait a bit for the CSRD to be applicable to third countries based companies. But maybe your company decided to already implement the CSRD at the group level and also in the EU. So it is very important. Maybe not. So if not, then it might arrive directly from the Swiss requirements. And if you already follow the CSRD requirements, then it's also nice for you to know that in Switzerland, it might also come. And with that, we also have some other developments in the world that we wanted to highlight to you. And for that, we have first a new taxonomy that was launched in Costa Rica. And so here it was to mention to you because taxonomies continue to pop up a little bit everywhere in the world. And here it's another example that Costa Rica now also has its sustainable finance taxonomy. So it's always something important to keep in mind as a company, financial or non-financial institutions. It's always interesting to keep an eye on all these taxonomies. We also have in Thailand something that is of interest for companies that is about the ESG ratings methodology, because the Stock Exchange of Thailand announced that it will strengthen the ESG rating methodology for listed companies, and they would align with global practices. And as you know, these ESG ratings methodologies have increased a little bit over the last months. That really we have now in the EU, in the UK, and in other jurisdictions, these ESG ratings that had a bit of attention to avoid this conflict of interest, to increase the transparency and so on. So now the Stock Exchange of Thailand say that they would align with these coming global practices. Also something interesting in a complete different topic that we wanted to highlight to you. It's about the US Department of Homeland Security, and this importation of goods produced with forced labor or with a risk of being produced with the forced labor, especially in this Jura region. I'm sorry for my bad pronunciation of the Chinese. And so they regularly update their strategy, and so that's the new strategy and the new report that this department has presented to the Congress. And so it's always interesting to have a look at the different new data that they have and the new strategy that they will implement. Also, in a complete different topic, but that's exactly the beauty of this presentation, that it's a lot of different topics that we bring together to keep you in the loop of all what happened in the world. That concerns the anti-greenwashing requirements, and that's in Canada, because we now have some amendments to the Canadian Competition Act. So to strengthen a little bit the fight against the anti-greenwashing allegations, let's say in Canada. So these amendments were finalized. And also this competition bureau has published a guide to these amendments to help a bit companies with these environmental and sustainability claims that they do. So yes, that was in June, end of June. And so you can have a look at these different guidance and new requirements to have a look. This anti-greenwashing overall requirements we observe a bit everywhere in the world. That is something that really the regulators pay a lot of attention to. And so it also happened in Canada, that we really observe in the different regulations that on the greenwashing is something that they really now fight. And they really want to make sure that companies don't say a lot of things that are not true. So the false allegations, false sustainability allegations are now more and more specifically addressed within the different regulations. We could always, we can discuss it. Legally speaking, we could always say that it was misleading, whatever it is, but now they really pay attention to specify that this is about sustainability misleading allegations. So that's the thing. And last but not least, we also observed, so we go back to the sustainability reporting requirements. We still observed several jurisdictions progressing the sustainability reporting requirements. And here we have especially the Botswana Stock Exchange, who published some guidance, and that is aligned with the GRI and the ISSB. Also in Chile, we have the Financial Market Commission, who proposed some regulatory changes to align its reporting requirements with the ISSB. And also in Australia, they adopted the Treasury Bill, and now they also have some climate-related reporting requirements in Australia. And this ISSB, we have not insisted that much today about the ISSB implementation, but of course, this is something that so we have the CSRD and the transposition of the CSRD in Europe, but the ISSB is also something that we observe being adopted or implemented a bit everywhere in the world. So that is also something very interesting to keep an eye on in terms of non-financial reporting. And with that, I think we are done with the presentation, which is not bad to have a lot of time, because I see that there is a lot of questions. Okay, maybe let's start from the very beginning. Let me scroll up. Okay, what does it mean if a country has not yet transposed the CSRD into national legislation? That's a very good question. And I would say, so it doesn't mean that companies doesn't have to implement it, because a directive has to be transposed. However, that brings a lot of challenge for companies that have to transpose. And for that, the EU has very specific processes, and this country, what it means, that means that the country will be will maybe be fined by the EU, because they really have to transpose the directives. And a lot of member states are regularly fined and convicted by the EU because they did not transpose on time. But practically speaking, that brings a lot of challenge for companies. Yeah, but in terms of compliance for the country, it just means that it has to transpose. So there is no choice for the member states to transpose. So you, as a company, I don't know, happy to discuss if you want to unmute yourself. But if you are based in one of the countries that has not transposed, I would still advocate and advise you to start to implement the CSRD, because there is no choice really for you as a company. You will have to implement the CSRD, whatever. It's just the member states. It's super challenging if they don't transpose yet. But actually, a lot of member states have at least started to transpose. Not all of them have finalized the full process, but there is still very, very little member states where we don't have any information on the transposition. But the vast majority of the member states have at least started and we have something concrete to base the analysis. So I hope that helps, but happy to discuss a little bit more if you want. Okay, then we have 3 questions in one. You may be covering this in the presentation. One, your view on the pace of Swiss regulations following CSRD for industrial. 2, penalties for non-compliance for Swiss headquartered companies versus CSRD. Fines, litigation risks, personal liabilities for disclosing as well as for progressing on the IROs. And 3, where does one find assurance expectations for CSRD reports, particularly for Swiss headquartered companies? So it's a lot of questions in one, and it's more maybe as a discussion. So again, happy to further discuss, and also here, Camille, if you have any point, just jump in. Huh? So I would say for the very first question, Swiss regulations following CR34. Yeah, here that's a trend that we really observe in Switzerland. Like there is regulations coming in Europe, in the EU, at the EU level, and a few years later, Switzerland implements very similar regulations. So that's one trend. And another thing that we observe now, I would say at the EU level, is that some EU regulations are also applicable to third countries-based companies. Like now for Swiss headquarters companies, if you have, so there are a few conditions. You must have some branches in Europe. In the EU, you must have a certain thresholds of activities. But still, if you fulfill the different conditions, then you will have to comply already with some EU regulations. So if you combine the two trends, I would say if you are quite a big companies or a high risk company, even if you're not based in the EU but based in Switzerland, I would not wait too long to really implement what is coming and what we observe coming. It's not exactly the same regulations that we observe in Switzerland and in the EU, but with a certain delay, it's very similar regulations that we observe. In terms of penalties, so that's a very recurring questions about the different penalties and the risks. Yes, of course, you can base your analysis on the penalties, and I'm happy. I might not give it to you all the different penalties and risks now here, but happy to give you a more detailed answer via email with the different penalties that we can observe. There is something that regulators want to avoid is exactly this compliance and penalties approach. What they really want is kind of a strategic approach and governance, you know, all that is based like as a strategy for you to implement the sustainability field, risks and processes implemented within the company as a whole approach, and not only to avoid the penalties. But I fully get the question, and it's important. But if you really want to follow the regulator's approach, then you don't really follow this penalties-based approach. And for the assurance, so yes, you will have to get the audit for the CSRD. It's first limited assurance, but they leave the door open to reasonable assurance. And for the new provision of the Swiss Code of Obligations, they follow exactly the same approach. So that is for that. I hope that answers. Camille, please jump in if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, maybe just very well, we'll try to keep it broad, but I think it's also important to have a look at how specific member states where you're interested in have transposed the CSRD, because the directive leaves open a bit of leeway for also in terms of assurance with certain requirements. So it can be that there are differences from country to countries, for example, with who is allowed to assure certain reports. So I think this is also important to keep in mind, that we can't really give a more of a generic answer, that it's also important to check from member state to member state if there's a specific member state that you do have in mind, Olga. Maybe that's just the only thing I want to add. I want to save as much time as we can for all the questions.
Thanks a lot. So yes, we also have the task force on inequality and social related financial disclosure. That is super interesting, and I think we'll dive into that for the next update that we will give you. That's super interesting because that follows the TCFD, TNFD, and now we have it for the social aspects. And that also follows the trend that we always say, like it all started with the climate. Now we also have nature, biodiversity, as Camille also mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation. And the next topic to come is the social aspects, which will bring more challenge maybe for companies a little bit, as biodiversity also bring a lot of different challenges. It's not database, you know, as you can for the climate risks. When do you expect the XBRL taxonomy to apply? So here it's not really detailed in the FRAC document. So we are still waiting for the EU Commission to adopt that. So it will also depend on when the EU Commission adopts it, and probably the EU Commission will fix a date of application, and to be seen if this will also be linked to the European single access point. So to be seen how it will all go together. But from the FRAG, we don't have any specific date. Can you provide sources and references? Yes. Do you have, maybe if you have specific? Yes, voilà. So we will share in the follow-up email you will receive. Yes, the source for the content of the presentation. Yes, we can include. Alors, does the Swiss Federal Act for CO2 reduction cover agricultural supply chains? Maybe this one is for you, Camille.
So thank you. That is a good question. I do have to admit, I would have to look more specifically into the question of agricultural supply chains. So Christoph, we're happy to send you a follow-up email, just that we don't say something wrong, to be sure. But what we do know with the amendments that it does specifically also address the agricultural sector. So the new amendments introduce targets for agricultural that would mean to reduce by 25%. So yeah, there is definitely this it does target the agriculture sector, but to have a look at the specifics of the Supply Chains Act, I would need to do a bit more research. So apologies for that, but you will hear from us and we'll specify a bit more there. Unless Tennessee, you know specifically here on this. All right, so we hope that's okay. Apologies for that.
Sorry that I don't.
But you'll hear from us on that topic.
Yes. Okay, then we have the European Artificial Intelligence Act and the scope. So for this, so the EU Artificial Intelligence Act applies to artificial intelligence systems and models that are developed, placed, or put into service or used in the EU. So it also applies when the artificial intelligence system output is used in the EU, regardless of where it was developed, deployed, or used. So I think that is very important to keep in mind, because that brings some extraterritoriality component of the act. And that goes together with what I just mentioned a few minutes ago about this extraterritoriality components that we observe more and more in EU regulations. I hope that answers. By when do you expect the new provision to enter into force? Here, I would admit that I don't have any precise timeline in mind, especially that for me, the Swiss system is always a bit complicated with all this if referendum, if no referendum, if yeah. So I don't really know. I don't have any timeline in mind, and I'm not sure this is specified in the project or in the explanatory thing report. That I guess they would implement that as soon as possible. But of course, yeah, you always have this possibility of referendum or no referendum. So yeah, so let's imagine a few months, plus then you have the 2 years of phase-in. I don't expect this to be really implemented before, let's say, 3 years minimum. But here, Camille, I don't know, you are maybe more familiar with the Swiss procedure.
Yeah, no, I can't really add much more. It's still quite an early stage onward, so I would just try to already take in the information now, and then there'll be more specific information that will be shared also, once the consultation closed and all the feedback is gathered. So hopefully we have a bit more in our next meeting, in our next webinar in December to share with you there.
Then we have some questions on the value chain, and I guess that is related to the focus on the potential new provisions. So yes, that would mean that you would have to map all the risks for your value chain, and of course this is based on the materiality. So yes, you would have to map your value chain within the material issues. And so you will have to take into consideration upstream and downstream activities in your assessment. Would the audit requirement trigger separate election of a statutory auditor specifically? Yes, so for all the audits here, again, it's also very early stage, and they refer to an additional explanatory ordinance to come if this is adopted. So they don't detail much for the audit things in the proposal and in the explanatory. They refer to something to come to further detail. According to this newly published FAQ for CSRD, we understand that by removing some exemption recognized for large companies, compliance is actually starting as of 2025. I'm not sure I get the question. So the FAQ does not remove any exemption. They maybe explain a little bit more the directive, but the scope remains exactly the same. So I think for the third party countries such as Turkey, it will not start as of 2025, but it stays 2028 or 9 as it was planned from the very beginning, from the directive. The FAQ does not change the scope of the directive. How can Switzerland or the EU laws apply to non-EU? Yes, these are separate jurisdictions, but you have like this Artificial Intelligence Act. If the product is used in the EU, then it has to respect a few requirements. That's the same with deforestation, for example. If you import in the EU some products based where there is a risk of deforestation, you have to comply with the reporting requirements. So yes, that's how they do now more and more, not all the time. And for the CSRD, for example, you need, of course, to have a branch that is in the EU and some activities in the EU. It's not completely out of the blue. You always need a link with the EU, of course, but they try to find more and more links. I think we are now running out of time. Alice, I don't know how you want me to proceed. Shall I continue or?
I think we can. So if you have 5 more minutes, Tennessee, you can go on. I think
Sure.
Since we are at the end of the meeting, I just would like to say goodbye to the people that have to jump probably to another call or another meeting. And for the ones who would like to stay on the line, please stay. And I don't know how you see that, Dennis, if you're going to be able to answer to all the questions.
let's see how far we can go.
Yes. But I would say
Okay.
another 5 to 10 minutes is
That's
still
perfect.
good. Thank you so much.
So thank you. We'll continue. And for the ones who have to jump out, thanks for joining. And it was a pleasure to be with you. So the next one would be, what do you see as the biggest challenge in implementing the new regulations, and what strategies should company adopt? So one of the biggest challenge, I would say, could be the amount of the regulations and how they go together. For example, you are big companies, you are a big company, you have a branch in the US, or you have some entities in the Americas. You have a lot in Switzerland, in the EU, and also in Asia. Then that's a bit difficult because you have in Europe, for example, all this CSRD double materiality-based approach, but in Americas, it's not completely different, but slightly different approach. So for me, one of the big challenge is the amount of regulations and how they all go together and where to start to implement the regulations. And one strategy that we observe sometimes is to take the most requiring regulations to make sure you comply with it. And by complying with it, you would then comply with a lot of other regulations. So that is something that we observe sometimes. But of course, the approach remains the same, that you have to map a bit your risks. Where do you have to comply? And to see a bit the different regulations and to find the most requiring or the strategically most important one to comply with, and then you comply, let's say, with the other ones. So there is a follow-up of these 3 questions. Clear on the compliance angle for some stakeholders. It just is the only motivation to take action. Yes. And frankly speaking, there are hardly any serious penalties, perhaps, except French transposition. Would be helpful to have some in the Australian and the Swiss. Yes, I could find you all the precise penalties. It's a lot of numbers. It's mainly fines, to be honest. We also have some personal responsibilities. That is also something that comes more and more in different jurisdictions. Personal responsibility of the board, I think. And that exists more and more. I cannot give you precisely all the different jurisdictions that have that, all the numbers now, but I can give you in an email the different, if you want. Happy to follow up on that. Thank you for the follow-up. And on operation, right? Not only. Yes, exactly. So when we talk about the value chain, it's of course the on operation, the subsidiaries, and then upstream and downstream. Yes, of course. It's all the chain. So starting from the on operation and then all the chain. Yes, and then new message. According to this newly published FAQ, we understand, but that's the same. No, I don't think, honestly, I really don't think that, voilà, please clarify. Yeah, but I really, I will double check to make sure, but an FAQ cannot change the scope of the directive. And I would be very surprised that they ask companies to start to comply like 3 years prior to what was announced. So I don't think that is correct, but I will double check because now I thought of that, but I really don't think the FAQ can change the directive. You may be, this is again the same. What is new here? I'm sorry, I'm a bit lost.
There are 3 follow-up questions from Sophia on the question to own operations at the very bottom. So it's only risks of the value chains, not IROs.
I'm not sure I see what you mean.
Maybe if Sophia is still on the call, she could just unmute and ask the questions.
Yes, I'm here.
Good, thanks.
Hello, thank you for the very, very useful briefing. I simply asked clarification regarding the value chain. And yes, it's the IG of IFRAG, the implementation guidance regarding supply chain and so on, refers to you referred earlier that yes, we need to map the risks of the value chain based on the materiality process. So my question, the clarification that I needed is that if we do the exercise of impacts, risks, and opportunities, IROs as an abbreviation, regarding value chain, upstream, downstream, and own operations, or only risks? What's your understanding so far? Impacts, risks, and opportunities of the value chain, or only the risks? That's it's not clear to me.
So my understanding, or our understanding of this covering of the value chain, is everything, like the whole arrow. It's not only the risks. You have to cover these requirements for the CSRD for the full value chain, But of course, this is limited to your material, to your materiality assessment. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
So when we do the process for the financial materiality and the impact materiality with the management team of my company, for example, we need to include in the materiality survey the IROs, not only for my company and the stakeholders, but the whole value chain, correct?
Mm-hmm. I would say so.
Okay, thank you.
So I think you have answered to all the questions, Tennessee.
Cool.
And Camille, thank you so much. That was a lot of questions today. So we see that things are moving and they are getting even always closer. So yeah, I would like to thank you, especially ECOFAC, Camille and Tennessee, for the very good briefing. And thank you to all the persons that attended today. And we see each other again in December. So have a very nice afternoon and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take
Alice.
care.
Bye.
Bye.